my son called and said,
"Wire $7,000 for a settlement."
I was shocked by the call. Apparently, his wife caused an accident while driving, injuring the other party. Is this a joke? I thought, because the woman sitting across from me during lunch was none other than his wife, the one who supposedly caused the accident. While I hesitated, my son abruptly hung up the phone. I began to suspect it might be a scam, but the caller ID on my phone clearly showed his number. Fuming, I was about to refuse when my daughter-in-law smiled and stopped me.
Let's pay for now. I have a good idea.
And so, as the two of us collaborated, the situation took an unexpectedly interesting turn.
"Mom, I finally got a job."
My 32-year-old son George happily reported to me. I replied, "Oh, that's great." George had spent a long time as an NEET or part-time worker, and honestly, I had almost given up hope that he'd find a job. So, I felt a huge sense of relief. Eventually, he married Olivia, a woman he got close to at work. Despite being 2 years younger than George, she was responsible and had a pleasant personality. We never had any mother-in-law daughter-in-law issues. Although George and Olivia didn't live with me, Olivia and I occasionally had lunch together. I thought, with a capable daughter-in-law and George having a respectable job, I can finally relax, but then. Before marrying Olivia, my son had a troublesome habit. Despite having no income, he was careless with money and impulsively bought whatever he desired. He even stole money from my wallet a few times. Why would you do such a thing? I sternly scolded him, trying to get an explanation. But my son just pouted and turned away, refusing to speak. Taking money from your parents' wallet, acting like a child even at this age, I couldn't help but cry, feeling embarrassed. Given that experience, I was a bit anxious about my son's married life with Olivia. "Hey, Olivia. How is George doing? Is he causing you any trouble?"
Oh, not at all.
I worried that he might take money from your wallet or do something wrong. Olivia assured me, flexing her arm as if to emphasize her point. It seems my son's household is under Olivia's capable management. Oh, that's a relief. With you, everything will be fine. I sighed, grateful that George had found a good wife. One day, while having our usual lunch together, my daughter-in-law and I were enjoying our meal. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I checked the screen, it displayed my son's name as the caller. "Hello? George? What's going on? Why the sudden call?" George's voice sounded urgent, and I braced myself for bad news. However, his next words plunged me into a whirlwind of confusion.
"Listen carefully, Mom. Olivia had an accident while driving.
What?
The other party got injured, and they're really angry. They want us to pay $7,000 as a settlement."
I glanced at the person sitting across from me, the bewildered expression on my daughter-in-law's face. George.
"Anyway, if you can arrange the money, let me know right away. Bye."
He hung up abruptly, leaving me stunned. After the call ended, I remained utterly bewildered, lost in thought. Olivia had an accident? But she's right here. I wondered if my son had misunderstood something, yet there was an odd tension in the air.
Mom, are you okay?
Olivia, wearing a puzzled expression, asked about the call from George. I don't fully understand, but it's serious. George claimed that you had an accident.
What?
I was completely overwhelmed by the situation and desperate to come up with money. Olivia calmed me down and listened to my story, but Olivia's confusion mirrored mine.
What exactly is going on? I haven't been in an accident, and I'm not sure what George is talking about.
She then rested her chin on her hand, deep in thought.
Perhaps we should suspect a scam?
Olivia suggested. But that voice was undoubtedly George's.
Unless he suddenly caught a cold and sounded different. But he seemed fine this morning. If it's not him, then who?
The phone number displayed on my mobile matched George's. Olivia and I exchanged puzzled glances, both lost in contemplation. After all, if you haven't been in an accident, then that $7,000 settlement demand must be a lie. What could such a large sum be needed for?
I don't fully understand George's spending habits either.
Olivia sighed.
Well, when you see his room, maybe he'd waste it on something trivial.
Olivia explained. What do you mean? Olivia then shared details about George's recent behavior, and my anger flared up. George did that? Unbelievable. I won't stand for it. I grabbed my phone, intending to call George and give him a piece of my mind. But Olivia gently stopped me with a smile.
No need. Let's pay first.
Why?
I've got a plan.
Olivia said, her eyes twinkling. Hearing her revenge scheme for George, I couldn't help but grin. That sounds intriguing. Let's teach him a lesson.
Exactly. It's time to put him in his place,
Olivia declared. And so, Olivia and I joined forces, ready to leave George speechless. 3 hours later, I pretended to be deceived and called my son back. I've got the $7,000 ready. Let's meet in person for the exchange.
Wait a minute. I said to wire the money.
No, it won't work that way. Nowadays, banks scrutinize large wire transfers. It's more reliable to hand it over directly.
Okay. Where should we meet?
I specified the meeting location and prepared a paper bag with the $7,000.
Sorry for the wait.
My son appeared awkwardly, accompanied by an unfamiliar man. Who's this?
I'm James. I'm the one his wife hit with her car.
The man claiming to be the accident victim, James, had a rugged face with visible scars. However, those scars appeared old and not recent. Moreover, it was evident that he wasn't an ordinary person. George grinned, relieved.
Good. You brought the money.
George then demanded.
Hand over that $7,000 to me.
Before that, I have a question. I glanced between the alleged victim and George. Our apologies for any inconvenience caused by Olivia. Could you provide details about the accident?
Come on. Does it really matter?
It does. We might be eligible for insurance compensation, and we need to understand what happened. James narrowed his eyes at me, looking annoyed.
Look, I was suddenly involved in the accident, so I don't remember the details.
Yeah, I wasn't with Olivia, so I'm not sure.
Isn't that strange? How could both of you know that she caused the accident in that state? I placed my hand on my hip and tilted my head, feigning curiosity. Wait, could it be that surveillance cameras or dash cams captured the incident? If so, could you show me the footage?
Listen, lady. You've been nagging incessantly. Are you suggesting I'm lying?
The self-proclaimed victim's low voice carried a threatening tone. Although I felt fear, I couldn't back down now. I don't want to assume you're lying. I'm simply asking for evidence if you have any. Summoning my courage, I continued to lock eyes with James. In the midst of our standoff, my son interrupted our conversation.
Mom, stop it. Enough. Just hand over that $7,000.
His face clearly showed fear.
Yeah, right. There's no evidence. After all, I didn't cause any accidents.
Then, George was utterly shocked by the appearance of someone.
Olivia? Why are you here?
I didn't mention it, but when you called me, Olivia was having lunch with me. George stammered.
That's absurd. I didn't hear anything.
As my son retreated nervously, both Olivia and I closed in on him.
Why lie and make your mom prepare $7,000? The jig is up. Surrender.
We decided to present evidence to corner him. Actually, Olivia and I went to their house together to uncover George's misdeeds. While my son was away, we searched his room and found evidence of various wrongdoings. First, this is a loan agreement for debt. It stipulated that if he didn't repay the borrowed $7,000 within a month, he'd have to pay additional delay damages. However, the amount was substantial and not from a reputable financial institution. So, I turned my attention to the person next to George. She wasn't involved in any accident. So, who are you? James chuckled.
Heck, guess I'm caught.
As expected, the man claiming to be the accident victim was actually a debt collector who had lent money to my son. James explained.
Your son asked for my help in securing the $7,000. Pretending to be the victim seemed like a good idea, but it's clearly not working.
While James found it amusing, my son looked apologetic and shrank back nervously.
So, you already know why your son borrowed $7,000, right?
Yes. When I saw my son's room, I was speechless. I showed a photo of George's room taken with my smartphone. The room was filled with an overwhelming number of anime character dolls.
I searched the price on my phone, and I was shocked. Figures can be so expensive.
Among George's belongings, there were high-priced items exceeding $700. We also found receipts from when he purchased the figures, which served as evidence. As a parent, it's hard for me to say this, but my son is careless with money. His salary is entirely managed by his wife. Where would he find the money to buy such expensive things?
If he stole from my wallet, I'd slap him immediately.
We somehow understood the reason behind his debt, and my daughter-in-law and I were left dumbfounded by the trivial explanation.
I knew about your hobby, but if it costs this much, I would have stopped you.
Well, what else could I do? Figures are like works of art, once in a lifetime. If you don't buy them at that moment, you might never get such rare items.
Olivia glared at our son with a mix of surprise and anger. George, on the verge of tears, desperately tried to justify himself. I understand that feeling.
So, you'll forgive me, right? With that $7,000, I can finally be free from debt.
But George, borrowing money from questionable sources and making reckless purchases can lead your life astray. After delivering my message, I tossed a paper bag at George. He caught it, and as he checked the contents, his eyes widened in shock.
What's this? Just newspaper cut into the shape of bills?
I'm not that kind-hearted to prepare $7,000 when I know I'm being deceived. James chimed in, amused.
Well, well, things have taken a turn. So, George, isn't this a different story?
George, holding the newspaper-made bundle, looked pale and bewildered. Hearing James's smug voice, he trembled. Olivia was furious with my son too.
Using my name to swindle money from my beloved mom. I can't believe it. I'm divorcing you.
And I'm considering severing our family ties, I added. George stammered.
Wait, both of you.
Despite George's tearful pleas, Olivia and I shook off his grasp and left the scene. Behind me, I heard George sobbing while James burst into laughter. Afterward, I advised George to sell all the figures in his room and use that money to repay the debt. He seemed deeply troubled, but he accepted the advice and managed to raise the $7,000 to pay James back. I decided to sever ties with my son, but before doing so, I offered one last piece of advice. From now on, live an honest life. However, George's collector's instinct persisted, leading him to repeat the cycle of debt and find himself pursued by loan sharks. Olivia, once his wife, divorced him long ago, but we still enjoy lunches together. Reflecting on George's story, Olivia remarked,
Changing one's way of life isn't so simple for humans.
and we shared a laugh. While watching her smile, I silently wished for Olivia's happiness.
How did you find this story? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Until next time.
I'm Amber. I'm just an ordinary housewife. My husband Henry is very kind, and we've never had an argument. It might sound like we're bragging, but we really are a very happy couple. Since my parents have already passed away, we are now living in an apartment near my in-laws. The reason is quite simple, in case when we have children or something happens, and in the future when my in-laws might need care. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, so I agreed to live here. However, every time I met my in-laws and had a meal with them, I inexplicably started feeling unwell, experiencing stomach aches and such. I refrained from eating at my in-laws' house for a while, but one day, I had a situation where I couldn't refuse, so I decided to visit them. But then, the unexpected happened there, leaving us utterly shocked. Furthermore, it was revealed that my mother-in-law had been doing something outrageous behind our back, leading to a sudden turn of events regarding the mysterious health issues I had been experiencing. This is a story from before I started experiencing health issues. Actually, my husband and I never had a wedding ceremony. I'm not particularly fond of being in the spotlight, and we both thought it would be better to spend the money on travel and hobbies instead of a wedding ceremony. My mother-in-law, knowing we didn't have a wedding ceremony, suggested we at least have a meal together. Apparently, she runs a free cooking class as a hobby, and she's quite skilled at it. So, she was eager to treat me, her new daughter-in-law, to her homemade dishes. I didn't have any reason to refuse, and I was actually delighted that she made such a proposal. So, my husband and I went to my in-laws' house, and there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really welcome. Although she verbally welcomed me with phrases like "welcome," "please come in," her eyes didn't reflect any warmth or hospitality. Of course, she was genuinely happy when talking to her son, my husband, but she couldn't hide her coldness towards me. Despite my inner turmoil, the dinner began, and my mother-in-law started placing her lavish homemade dishes in front of us. Some of the dishes were so exquisite that you'd find them only in expensive restaurants. I was so captivated by the food that I almost forgot about my mother-in-law's earlier cold attitude. When I expressed my gratitude to my mother-in-law for preparing such wonderful dishes, she smiled happily and told me to eat as much as I wanted. So, maybe I was just under the impression that I wasn't welcome. Thinking that way, I had a really enjoyable time. However, that night, I experienced severe stomach aches. While I was stuck in the bathroom, my strength drained away, and I began to lose consciousness. In the end, I was taken to the nighttime emergency room by my worried husband. It was nighttime, so there were no specialists available, and the exact cause couldn't be determined, but they ruled out food poisoning. Personally, I wondered if it was because I had eaten expired bread in the morning. However, we couldn't find out what the cause was. After receiving intravenous fluids for 2 hours and resting, I gradually started feeling better, so my husband and I returned home and went to bed. Since then, every time I visited my in-laws and had a meal, I suffered from unexplained health issues. When I talked about this with a friend I hadn't seen in a while during lunch, she said that visiting in-laws could stress me out. She had actually experienced health issues due to bullying from her mother-in-law, and her symptoms improved after moving to an apartment further away from her in-laws. I never really thought that going to my in-laws' house was stressful, but perhaps somewhere in my heart, I might have felt that way without realizing it. That's what I thought. Since I got sick every time we visited my in-laws, even my husband became worried. So, at his suggestion, we decided not to visit them for a while. We didn't know the exact cause, but I got sick every time we had a meal at in-laws, so my husband suspected that it might be my mother-in-law's cooking. It seems my mother-in-law has been contacting my husband repeatedly, expressing that she feels lonely when we don't eat together. However, my husband has been declining on my behalf, considering my well-being. However, this time my husband came to me with a gloomy face, saying that he couldn't refuse. It was about attending the wedding announcement of my brother-in-law and his wife. Apparently, there will be a family gathering and dinner at my in-laws' house, and of course, we were asked to attend. Even though I didn't really want to see my mother-in-law, I couldn't ignore my brother-in-law and his wife just because of that, so we decided to go. However, no one could have imagined that such a huge commotion would erupt during this dinner gathering. Still, my husband, who was concerned about my health, said he would tell his mother about me and I didn't have to eat anything. And then, the day arrived. My mother-in-law, as usual, greeted my husband with a smile, but I felt that her attitude towards me was even colder than before. When we were shown into the room, my brother-in-law and his wife were already there, chatting with my father-in-law. As my mother-in-law continued to serve her homemade dishes one after another, they looked as beautiful as ever and made you drool. No matter how many times I thought about it, I just couldn't figure out why I would get sick after eating such delicious-looking food. As soon as we sat down, my mother-in-law immediately urged me to eat. My husband quickly stepped in, saying,
"Amber isn't feeling very well today."
However, this didn't matter to my mother-in-law at all. She handed me a small plate of food and stared at me with a silent smile, as if saying, "You can eat at least this much, right?" I felt torn and didn't know what to do. Upon hearing my husband's comment,
"Amber, thank you for coming even though you're not feeling well. We just wanted to say hello today, So if you start feeling unwell, please feel free to go home and rest.
He was trying to protect me. It seemed my husband told my brother-in-law and his wife. They were aware of the situation, so they were on my side. With both of her sons advocating for me, my mother-in-law decided not to insist on me eating the food right away.
Well then, I'll pack some in a container for you. You can eat it later, and let me know what you think.
I was wondering why she wanted me to eat her food so much, but I figured I could always make excuses later, so I just nodded. Then, as my mother-in-law got up to fetch the container, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. All of us turned our attention to the kitchen, and there was my father-in-law clutching his stomach in pain. He hadn't even touched the food yet, so we didn't know what had caused it. In a panic, my mother-in-law rushed to support my father-in-law and asked him what was wrong.
My stomach. It hurts so much. I just ate some food in the kitchen before everyone arrived.
With that, he collapsed.
No way. That was meant for Amber. But this isn't the time to worry about that. We need an ambulance.
She frantically called for an ambulance, and then accompanied my father-in-law to the hospital. Left behind, we could only stand there in shock for a while, but one thing my mother-in-law said stuck with me. My father-in-law had eaten something that had been set aside specifically for me and then complained of severe stomach pain. This meant that there was some kind of secret hidden in that food. I got curious and then I stepped into the kitchen, a place my mother-in-law never allowed me to enter. What I saw there left me speechless. Finally, the cause of my unexplained health issues and my father-in-law's collapse became clear. I couldn't believe someone would do such a thing. Well, I won't go easy on her anymore. I'm ready. We each drove our own car to the hospital where my father-in-law was taken. After completing the check-in process, we headed straight to the hospital room, where we could hear voices from inside. One was my mother-in-law's, and the other was probably a male doctor. It sounded like my mother-in-law was being questioned about what had happened and why my father-in-law had collapsed like that.
I've already said I don't know anything. We were just having a meal together when he suddenly collapsed.
Are you sure? Whether it's spoiled food or expired items, anything you can think of.
I've already told you, I don't know anything.
Even when questioned by the doctor, my mother-in-law continued to insist that she didn't know anything. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door of the private room. My mother-in-law hurriedly came out, and as soon as she saw my face, she stammered,
"Oh, Amber, Henry. You're here. Dad will be fine, so why don't you go back home and have dinner?"
She seemed a bit flustered, so I grabbed the closing door and said with a smile, "No, I have something to talk to you about." Behind me, there was my husband putting silent pressure on her, and my brother-in-law and his wife looking at her with scornful eyes, so she couldn't refuse outright.
Fine.
She reluctantly let us in. It seems that my father-in-law's condition has stabilized somewhat, as his complexion has improved, but the cause of his collapse is still unknown. The doctor told us, after arriving at the hospital, he was conscious for a while and went to the bathroom several times, but then he became severely dehydrated and lost consciousness completely.
Well, you know, he's getting older, and he's been drinking nothing but beer lately.
She tried to brush it off with a forced laugh. However, she realized that she couldn't deceive neither the doctor nor us, and fell silent, perhaps not to give herself away. Then, I looked straight into my mother-in-law's eyes and pulled something out of my bag, pointing it at her. When she saw it, her eyes widened, and she broke out in a cold sweat, and was clearly shaken. This is a laxative, isn't it? There were traces of it in powdered form. Can you explain? I said coldly, but my mother-in-law remained silent. Upon seeing it, the doctor said with a start,
Ah, I see. It's quite common to suspect laxatives as the cause of continued diarrhea when it's not food poisoning or anything else.
Then they did further examinations, and it was indeed confirmed that my father-in-law had ingested a large amount of laxatives. This caused his intestines to become hypersensitive, leading to frequent diarrhea and abdominal pain. This ultimately led to dehydration, as diagnosed by the doctors.
No, it's not like that. At first, I thought it would be great if she just suffered a little. But you, Amber, were so calm about it, so I gradually increased the amount.
She finally confessed with no way to escape the situation. The reason for such an action was simple. She felt that I had taken her beloved eldest son away from her. So, what started as a malicious act of mixing a small amount of laxative gradually escalated, and she ended up adding a quantity that caused my father-in-law to collapse. I was appalled, but I said to my mother-in-law, "What you did is beyond comprehension. You have serious issues as a person. Do you know how many times I had to go to the hospital for 4 drips because of what you did? And yet, I can't understand why you would even think to mix such a dangerously large amount." Unable to retort, my mother-in-law hung her head in frustration. And then, the barrage of criticism continued against her.
Mom, this is terrible. Amber happened to be tolerant of it and nothing serious hasn't happened to her yet. But what you're doing is no different from being a criminal.
After my husband said that,
I can't believe it, but were you planning to do the same to Jessica? It's terrifying to even think about.
my brother-in-law said this while glaring at my mother-in-law and putting his arm around his wife's shoulder. Then the doctor added,
You must not use medication inappropriately. As your son said, your daughter-in-law happened to have a mild reaction, but it seems your husband doesn't have much tolerance for laxatives, which is why he had such a severe reaction this time.
Shut up. Because.
11 Though my mother-in-law was a grown woman, she cried like a child. Then, we heard a voice coming from another direction.
You. How could you do such a cruel thing?
I turned towards the source of the voice and saw my father-in-law, who had regained consciousness, looking at us and speaking. Mother-in-law, with tears in her eyes, took my father-in-law's hand.
I'm sorry. I never meant to harm you.
But my father-in-law forcefully pushed her hand away. My mother-in-law froze, unable to accept what had just happened. Seeing her like that, my father-in-law let out a heavy sigh and said,
Even if you didn't mean to harm me, you've been tormenting Amber all this time. Unbelievable. This is not the act of a decent human.
Feeling overwhelmed by his words, my mother-in-law clung to my father-in-law, pleading for forgiveness. And to me, my mother-in-law said,
I apologize for everything I've done. I won't ever do such a thing again. So please forgive me. If you forgive me, I'm sure everyone will be satisfied. Right.
I couldn't help but smirk, thinking that this was probably just an act, and she wasn't truly reflecting on her actions. Haha. What are you saying now? I can't forgive you. Do you have any idea? I said, and then my husband stood beside me and continued.
Mom, stay away from Amber. Anyone who hurts my beloved wife isn't family to me.
Henry.
Rejected by her beloved son, my mother-in-law collapsed to her knees. Seeing this, my brother-in-law nodded in agreement.
I don't want to be with someone who might harm Jessica either. From now on, I won't have anything to do with Mom.
Realizing that her ugly jealousy had caused this situation, my mother-in-law kept crying and begging for forgiveness. However, no one said a word. We all just stood there, silently looking down at her. Thinking she could only rely on her husband now, my mother-in-law, seemingly forgetting that he had just pushed her away, cried out to him,
Honey, you won't abandon your wife, will you?
But my father-in-law, with a firm voice, shouted,
No, I'm divorcing someone who would do such a thing.
Hearing this, my mother-in-law was utterly shocked.
It's time to go home. Dad, please get some more rest.
We all nodded at my husband's words, said our goodbyes to my father-in-law, and left the room. While waiting for my husband to bring the car around to the entrance, I saw my mother-in-law running towards me, out of breath as if she had chased after me.
Amber. Please, forgive me. I'm begging you.
Seeing my mother-in-law's tear and snot-covered face, I responded, There's no reason for me to stay with someone who puts my life at risk. If I were to forgive you now, it wouldn't do you any good. At that moment, my husband pulled up in the car, so I got in and said, We won't meet again. Take care. With that cold farewell, my mother-in-law looked into the distance, tears streaming down her face, muttering something as she gazed up at the sky. Afterward, as promised, my father-in-law divorced my mother-in-law and moved out, and both my husband and brother-in-law cut ties with her. Until then, my father-in-law had been the one listed on the apartment lease and had been paying the rent, but now that he's gone, my mother-in-law has to pay the rent herself. However, as a homemaker who didn't know how to earn a living, my mother-in-law managed to make ends meet initially with some portion of the property settlement, but it quickly fell apart. She tried to monetize her cooking classes by reaching out to various people, but the recent scandal became gossip, and she lost all her students. Ultimately, unable to pay the rent, my mother-in-law was evicted from her home. It was then that she finally realized the severity of her situation and began to look for a job. However, without a place to live, finding a job proved to be quite challenging. Currently, she is said to be living on the streets. It's a perfect example of karma, isn't it? As for us, I was relieved from the unexplained health issues, and immediately afterward, I found out I was pregnant. Actually, my husband and my father-in-law still have been in regular contact since he left the house, so when he found out about my pregnancy, he was even more delighted than us, the parents-to-be. He eagerly awaited his first grandchild, and even before the baby was born, he helped prepare baby supplies and purchased expensive baby gear like strollers and car seats, which has been a huge help. And once the baby was born, he turned into a complete doting grandparent. I always thought of him as quiet because he didn't talk much, but it turns out he's quite mischievous and fun-loving. It's delightful to discover this side of him that we didn't know before. At my brother-in-law's place, twins were born, making our lives even more lively. We're really looking forward to this new chapter. Well then, everyone. Goodbye.